one of the things that's so great about this book is that what we understand more about the horrors of colonial rule. What's fascinating is that so much of it falls to a company rather than to a government, despite the fact that in the end, the prince of the title eventually manages to go to the government, and it's Parliament that helps him succeed. One of the problems with doing this interview, I was thinking as I read the book, is it is so rich in both international, Indian history, British history, but also personal history. And I think the first question I'd like to ask is your relationship to this piece of history and this man. It doesn't quite clearly explain in your biography, but it hints at the fact that this is your family.
That's right. Yeah, it's a personal story. It's the story of a family that, the Mughal Empire was at its peak in through to the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s. But this is the story of a family that was the governing family of India's greatest port, which was called Surat. And what that family goes through over a period of 130 odd years, struggling against the rise of the East India Company in that part of India, and subsequently it culminates in this incredible fight for justice in Parliament, in British Parliament in 1856. And the protagonist of this book is my great-great-great-grandfather.
That's what I couldn't quite work it out, but and there's a lovely bit in the dedication, I think, or somewhere where you dedicate the book to your daughters and to the memory of his daughters, because it was for them and their rights that he was fighting. You walk down Warwick Avenue with your daughters and reminisce about the time when he was living in Little Venice, up in North London, Maida Vale in North London. Is that's still something you do with it? This is very much alive in your family, this internationally important little story.
It is, because it's a story that we grew up with, about how he comes to England in 1844 after the East India Company has stripped him of everything. And he comes because he's a father of two daughters, and the East India Company do not let his daughters succeed. And as a result, he's left with only one option, which is to come to Britain to challenge the East India Company on their home turf. It's something that has never been done before. It's an unprecedented move. And he's, oddly enough, he lands up getting some pretty special support through Victoria and Albert. And it's the only occasion, or the only time, when Victoria supports an Indian against her own empire, against the machinations of her own empire. And the East India Company at that point in time is at the forefront of empire expansion. My daughters live in India, and they visit me every summer and in the winter. And we walk down that street because, and particularly Warwick Avenue, which is where my ancestor lived for a period of 5 years in England, running this campaign for justice. And it strikes a chord with us, because it's something that which has come down from generations. It's a story that has been very close to us, and I thought that this story needed to be told. I think a lot has been written about what happened in Delhi, what happened with the annexation of various larger states, particularly the fight between Wellesley and Tipu Sultan and all of that. But not much was written about this particular port, which was India's foremost port before the East India Company destroyed it and built Bombay.
Well, that's one of the most fascinating things that cropped up for me, was the sort of creation of Bombay as we know it, or as it became to be known. When you first mention it, I think you describe it as a collection of small islands, which the East India Company decide to relocate to in a way. That sort of tied in with your the beginning of the book really gives a very a detailed history of the area.
Yes.
And who lived there and where they'd come from. Perhaps in relation to the East India Company's presence and strengthening power there, you could just précis that first quarter of your book. But I mean, just to give an idea, because actually without that background, it's difficult to know quite, as you say, the destructive force with which the East India Company ploughed through that place.
Yeah. Bombay as we know it as today didn't really exist. It was a cluster of 6 or 7 little islands that came as dowry when I believe Catherine of Braganza married Charles, and she brought them as dowry. Surat, which was this really incredible port, which was bursting with all with incredible color and in some exotic bazaars, and was the foremost port of India, was systematically destroyed by the East India Company so that they could build Bombay, and Bombay comes into prominence as a nemesis to Surat, which is this incredible port, and because of the demise of Surat, there is incredible unemployment. There is a certain sense of unease, and then the usurping of the estates of the ruling family of Surat is the final final straw, and the only thing left for the family to do is to come and bring their case to Britain and expose the malpractices of the East India Company to the British people. Because the company basically is, it's just a corporation. It's a corporation that, oddly enough, finds itself in India when the Mughal Empire is floundering. It gets rich. It's able to hire a large number of local Indian sepoys to fight their battles, and it becomes, it really becomes this powerful machine for empire expansion. And it's quite ruthless in the way it usurps large chunks of Indian territory. But when this gentleman comes to Britain and explains what the East India Company has been up to, it's fantastic, because the British aren't, the common people in Britain aren't quite aware of what precisely the English East India Company is up to. And when they realize and they get to know about its malpractices, the end game plays out in the House of Commons.
Yeah, but there are, you're careful not to depict the whole of the colonizing power as evil, because there are members of the company, but also British parliamentarians who are also on the side of this. In fact, even before he leaves, he gathers some English support, and which is, I think they're quite vital. The undoing of the company in Parliament in the end is farcical, really. It just goes to show that they're all at each other's throats, and it's lunacy. But there are people who support him from the beginning, aren't there?
Yes, of course. As I said, majority of Britain, at least. Well, let's just take a step back. If we were to look at the way India was colonized, I think you break it up, broadly speaking, in 2 parts, which is 1757 till 1857, which is 100 odd years, where the company is at its it's an utterly brutal corporation. And then in 1857 you have this incredible mutiny that takes place, where India rises, seeking its independence from the East India Company. And then from 1857 till 1947 you have a period of about 90 years where India becomes Britain's most romantic colony, because there's a certain sense of understanding that's established. The company is completely crushed, and India in 1857 moves from company to crown. But to your point, yes, when he comes seeking justice in 1844 and then in 1857, he's pleasantly surprised that he gets an enormous amount of support. here in Britain for his cause. Large number of members of Parliament, particularly in the House of Commons, support him. Victoria and Albert, as I mentioned earlier, support him. In fact, Albert even introduces him to, the Solicitor General, who actually fights his case.
I mean, you perhaps should explain how he comes to meet Albert, because Albert isn't just presented to him when he arrives here.
Yeah.
I mean, he sort of ingratiates himself. He manages to ingratiate himself with the highest society in London until, is it at Ascot?
Yes.
Yeah, it's at Ascot that he finally bumps into Victoria and Albert and manages to gain there. But how does he start on that climb to that ascension to?
Well, I think in 1842, the Nawab of Surat. Nawab was the Muslim variant of a Hindu Maharaja. So if you were Hindu, then the title was Maharaja, and if you were Muslim, then the title was Nawab. So in 1842, the Nawab of Surat passes away, and he leaves behind a daughter who's ailing, and she dies of tuberculosis, leaving behind just two daughters again. So the father of these two daughters wants his daughters to succeed, but the English East India Company imposed something called the doctrine of lapse. And it's utterly ironic, because by that time, so the doctrine of lapse basically is if an Indian ruler does not have a male heir, without giving him the choice for collateral succession, which means his uncles or his uncle's son could succeed, or giving him the choice of adoption, or allowing him to get his daughters to succeed, the English East India Company would just invade his territory or take it up or take it over.
And that order of lapse was used all over India, because he had actually been adopted at some point.
He had been
in
adopted,
order to stop that happening.
Yes.
And then they just steamroller over everything. There's no way out. Really.
There's no way out. And not just that, so the English East India Company target this family because it's an incredibly wealthy family. It's the ruling family of India's greatest port. And so they target this family, and they not just take away their ruling powers, but then they strip them of their personal estates. So every home, every garden, every personal piece of estate is taken over by the company and put up on for public auction, and that leaves the two girls who are infants on the brink of destitution. So that is what happens in 1842. So in 1844, the father of the two girls comes to Britain, and he tries to meet the movers and shakers in the company here in London, and he doesn't get a good enough hearing. But his secretary, who's an Englishman, tells him, listen, we've got one last chance to create a bit of a stir in England, and that chance is at Ascot. So put on your turban, put on your robes, put on some jewels, and come to this grand event, and I'll get you in a box which is relatively close to a really powerful couple, and that couple happens to be Victoria and Albert. By that time, Victoria has got a really soft spot for India. She's never been to India. She doesn't know much about the country, but murmurings of the misdoings of the East India Company are getting to.
She likes the food, doesn't she? Famously like the food.
She does. She quite enjoys the curry, and she hears of these malpractices of the East India Company. And it so happens that the protagonist of the book is also at Ascot. And she sees this exotic-looking Oriental, and she asks to be introduced to him. And Albert and she get introduced. And Albert actually asks him what brings him to England, from such a faraway land. And that's when he gives a very quick synopsis of his case. And both Victoria and Albert are, utterly moved by what he said. And that's when Albert invites him to an event at the Strand, which is the 57th anniversary celebrations of the Royal Society of Arts. And that's an exhibition that Albert has been promoting, where he gives away presents and gifts for innovation in science and technology. And by that time, Britain is at the forefront of industrial advancement. And it's at that event that Albert introduces the Indian prince to his own Solicitor General, Sir Richard Bethell. And Sir Richard Bethell, who's the Solicitor General to the Queen, hears the case, and he's utterly moved as well. And he takes up the case to take this into Parliament.
And it's sorry, come on.
No, go on.
Well, it's him that eventually he drops the final.
Yeah,
the end of the climactic. Court.
Yeah, but he fails in 1844. So in 1844, while Richard Bethell and Albert and all of these, powerful big guns in British law listen to his case, they're not able to get enough traction because he doesn't have the money to stay on in England and sue the company in England. He has to get back to India. And when he gets back to India, he realizes that he won't get justice there. So he mortgages everything that he has, and he comes back to England in 1853. And this time he's utterly determined to fight the English East India Company on their home ground. Yeah. By that time, the East India Company starts panicking because they realize that he's backed by Richard Bethell and Victoria and Albert. And the East India Company has their own MPs in Parliament who then decide to fight his bill. And that's the chapter, Heat in Parliament.
I'm going to play devil's advocate now.
Yeah.
You could and should look at this story in the light we have been. There is a different way of looking at this man, what happens when he goes to England, and you'll probably guess what I'm going to talk about. But when he arrives here, on the first visit, he has a wife who is ill, and he takes a lover here, and he then goes back to India, as in the way you've just described. And then he comes back again, and he doesn't. By this time, and then when he's back in India, his wife has died. He has married someone else, which has been arranged, but he's married to someone else, and there is a not amicable relationship between that woman and his daughters. So he is absolutely determined with his course of action that he's going to continue fighting. He goes back to England. Well, he doesn't just take a lover; he falls in love.
Yeah.
And eventually, after his success, he takes back this young English actress to live in India alongside his Indian wife. Now, aside from the customs of having more than one wife, when he comes to England, he also has a bit of a jolly. And there was a part of me thinking, Christ, he's just gallivanting around town, getting his underway, flashing his jewels, and it's all, partly because we know from the title of the book, the premise of the book, that he's going to win. At this point, you're not sort of rooting for him, thinking, go on, have a call. We don't know what's going to happen. He might die in the next. I know he's going to come back victorious. And I also think, is that a completely unfair thing? And did it ever? Because you don't touch on it, but I was kept thinking, God, if anyone finds out nowadays, the press, if they'd found out, they would have had him. They would have destroyed him on moral character. And I kept thinking that would have been the way that the East India Company could have destroyed his great reputation, which was amazingly being built up in the press and amongst the common people of England, would have been shattered, I would think, had they discovered that actually he was being unfaithful to his wife and his children and his family at home. I mean, is that something you don't talk about it at all? It's just that you tell the story as it happened. But does that ever cross your mind?
Well, he's the character is a vulnerable character, and he's not. He's definitely not Superman. He's got.
Well, he's
huge,
Superboy. When he's a teenager, he's pretty well Superman.
And he's at 26 he comes to England, and he comes to England. His wife is dying of tuberculosis. There has been no intimacy between him and his wife for the last 1.5 years because it's a fatal disease. And so, you know, you can't blame him for having a bit of a jolly time at 26. So he has a good time, which is fine.
He has a good time with someone's wife.
No, not with someone's wife.
Doesn't he have? Someone else is trying to have it with someone.
No. So he does have a, you know, he does have a jolly good time. He goes to operas and he goes to all these incredible events. But he's, you know, he does have flaws in his character. There's no doubt about that. The fact that he comes back to England single-mindedly focused on his cause in 1853, but still lands up falling in love, is something which I think is once again quite vulnerable, because even his second marriage is an arranged marriage. Yeah. You know, like it happens in India, he's compelled to marry this, you know, his second wife. He's not in love with her. At the same time, he realizes that if he doesn't come to England and you know, fight for his rights and the rights of his daughters, you know, it's a life of misery there. Yeah. And then he comes to England and yeah, you know, he has a great time. He falls in love with an English actress. You know, it's something that we in our family have grappled with for a very long time. Okay. We've tried to find this actress's grave here in Britain as well. We've not been able to find it. No,
because there's also there's a I don't think it gives away too much. I mean, they
don't give away the
I won't give away the very end, but it is slightly tragic, the end.
Yeah.
You know, in a way, and also actually, of course, for Surat.
Yeah.
It's you know, again, we can discuss this without giving away too much, but. You know, maybe you could talk about the fate of that city from it. It's lovely to hear that it's happened to it now.
Yes.
And whether or not, you know, obviously all history, you know, everything that's happened today is connected to history. But of course, it didn't all work out well straight away, despite his efforts.
Yeah. His return to India with Mary Jane, who's the English actress that he falls in love with, is you know, is something which he actually can't help, and he also doesn't want to help it, because he's utterly in love with her. You know, he's completely besotted by, you know, her light hair and her blue eyes, and you know, we've got letters where he just goes on about this exotic beauty, because you know, he
from Burnley.
Yeah, from Burnley.
It doesn't get said very often.
From Burnley. So you know, he's completely taken in by her, and he takes her back to India. But he comes back to a city that has been completely ravaged by the East India Company. It's in a shambolic state. You know, a once bustling port is now virtually non-existent. Bombay has taken it over it in every respect. What he's won back is the guaranteed income for his daughters and the landed estate that they can actually, you know, build new homes on and live in security. He does not win back the ability or the right to rule over Surat, because that's gone. And so Surat loses relevance in India, and particularly to Bombay, you know, dramatically. What's happened to Surat now is actually quite astonishing, because you know, with the economic revival of India, Surat has gone on to become the 4th fastest growing city in the world, and the diamond cutting capital of the world. So, you know, 80% of the world's diamonds are cut and polished in Surat and then sent to their destinations worldwide. So it's a real revival, but that is purely because of the entrepreneurial spirit of the merchants of that city.
And is there much at all left of that old city?
There are pockets of that. So the castle is being restored by the government.
Oh right. Okay.
And you know, the castle that was built in the 15th century, in the 16th century, is now being brought to life. You know, there are parts of old Surat which has some beautiful architecture that dates back to Shah Jahan's time, and Shah Jahan was the emperor who built the Taj Mahal. So you know, you see bits and pieces of it, but the grandeur of the Nawabs is lost. You know, that's been completely destroyed.
And now that is you live in London now, but you grew up in India.
Yeah.
And did you grow up there?
Yeah.
And so there's family. There's more than there's other family. Is there? There's still descendants.
Yeah. My parents live there.
Right.
My uncles live there, and so extended family, immediate family, they're all there.
And is this history alive and interesting to people in Surat now? I mean, I think your book was published in India first. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Is it still? Is it a living history still?
Yes, that's a great question, because princely India, has always been associated with Rajasthan. The Maharajas of Rajasthan. Surat never, and to a certain extent Hyderabad because of the Nizam, but Surat never really got that dimension to its history. It was always, over the last 100 odd years or 50 odd years, been seen as this commercial city, where diamond cutting is done, etc. But with this book, a lot of people are realizing that there is a certain sense of Mughal history to it. There's a certain sense of charm to its past history, and particularly the gardens that were there, the orchards that were there, some of the most incredible Mughal buildings. They don't exist now, but there are records of it, and there is a certain awareness that is growing.
Yeah. And is it you talk in here about different strands of history at the same time that have been written about? Was researching this relatively easy because of your family connection, or did you go out? I mean, were you still learning as you wrote this? Because it seems to me it's so detailed and so rich that either it's someone which you say you were, brought up with these stories and the stories of this man, but it's also comprehensive, and also you must have referred to records of British Parliament about what happened in their day by day, because you've got speech that quoted from great tracts of parliamentarian debate.
Yeah.
It seems that was the research long, difficult?
It was quite it was an arduous task, because my grandfather gave me a book when I was 15 called The Debate in the House of Commons 1857, and those were the minutes recorded in Parliament, and that was the original copy.
Right.
And I didn't pay much attention to it. As a teenager, you're more interested in rock and roll and other stuff than just reading a debate in Parliament. But I carried it with me when I moved to England, and I read it here, and it was just absolutely amazing, because it brought to life an incredible story of the first time an Indian enters British Parliament. Yeah. It's never been done before. It happens in 1856 that an Indian enters British Parliament to challenge their own colonizing corporation, and that got me. So when I read that book, the debate itself got me, and the heated debate was something that I found utterly engrossing. Once I had read that, then it became very important to research the characters. It became very important to research Surat as a city and how it fell to the English East India Company. And I found the archives of the British Library absolutely phenomenal.
Oh, really?
And I'm a great fan of the British Library. It's incredible the way they've kept the documents, the manuscripts. So I found that utterly informative. The libraries in Surat and Bombay were terrific, but I did have to travel back and forth between Surat and London to get the research.
Yeah. And because it tells a story of that man coming here and succeeding and go away, you can't necessarily then follow off everything that sparks off. But of course you do mention the fact that other people back in India are getting word of this and thinking, well, we can all do this. I mean, it's time. It's time to do this, but it doesn't happen.
Yeah, no, Henry, but that's what I said, that it's so important to understand. When you read and try and understand colonial history, particularly the history of India, with regards to the Raj, the period between 1757 and 1857 was utterly ruthless. It was a single-minded devotion of the East India Company to just loot, and they did that without any holds barred. It is only from the late 1800s till 1947 when there is a certain sense of respect between Britain and India. There's a mutual sense of respect. Of course, there are, there have been many atrocities, even in that period. Jallianwala Bagh happened, where there was a massacre of the Sikhs and all of that. But there was a general sense of respect between the two. That didn't exist between 1757 and 1857. Now, when he's here in 1856, he becomes the symbol of Indian resistance in Britain. And as a result of that, there's a lot of press coverage in Britain about him, besides the fact that he's, having a good time, and his case. There's also an enormous amount of coverage of his case back in India. And you're right, there is a certain sense of, listen, if this man can do it in Britain, we'll do it as well. And so a few, for example, the Prince of Sindh, which was the port city of Karachi, which is now in Pakistan, he was unjustly deposed. So he comes to try and fight his case. The Begum of Awadh, which is Lucknow, she comes to and takes his advice in Britain to fight her case. So he becomes a symbol of Indian resistance. But what is incredible is that all of them realize that, Britain is prepared, the independent judiciary is prepared to give him a hearing, and he can tap into that. And so that became a huge thing for a large number of Indians to come and pursue here. That there is an independent judiciary. The English East India Company can be sued, they can be held accountable by the British judiciary.
I'm just going to say it's flown by. We're going to have to wrap it up in a sec. But we've got copies of the book for sale, so you can come up and buy it and have a chat, and you'll sign copies, no doubt. But before we do that, does anyone want to ask any questions? Yeah, sure.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to ask. At the moment in this country, there's a slight tendency now to question empire and colony, the benefits of colony. And I'm thinking in particular of Shashi Tharoor's book recently, which has come out. You're probably familiar with it.
Yes, he's endorsed my book. He launched it.
So I'm just wondering where do you stand on the need, if there is a need, to reassess empire and the perceived benefits of empire?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to study empire in school. I'm not sure if the empire is taught in British schools. I'm not sure. It's not. And I think it's important that it's taught in English schools. The pros and the cons, the good and the bad. I think there's a lot that India, can hold in terms of a grudge, if you wish, for being looted and all of that. But at the same time, I think there is a certain sense of understanding that was established, in the early 1900s, and there were benefits. So while I agree with Dr. Shashi Tharoor on a large number of things that he says when he's very anti-empire, but I don't agree with him entirely. I think when he makes an argument that, for example, he makes an argument that the railways were not necessarily meant for Indians, and it was only for transporting goods from one place to another. That can be debated. But he makes a profound argument that in 1757, India contributed, undivided India, which was Pakistan, India, Bengal, contributed 27% of global GDP, and when the East India Company left, or not really, but when the empire came to an end in India, India contributed only 2%. So it was a complete destruction of Indian industry. But then there's so much, that India has gained as well. For example, the English language, I believe, has kept us way ahead of China, at least in terms of, the way we do business. I think, our independent judiciary, is something that we inherited from the British system, our education system. So it's a mixed bag. But I think it's important to study empire in British schools, and I'm not sure if it's studied.
Well, the problem is history isn't even a compulsory subject in school.
Yeah.
What my campaign would be for a museum of empire.
Yes.
I think it's important that people have a balanced view.
Yeah.
of empire.
I think that's important. One must have a balanced view, because that's important.
Well, then,
Yeah, I just find it slightly hard to believe that the East India Company would not have found out that what he was doing in England and having these affairs and things, because they had such a vast network of spies out there that it's amazing that, because they were ruthless.
Yeah.
So
well, I
maybe
didn't really get the impression he was even trying to keep it secret.
No, he didn't. And I think I think the cause that he was fighting, was so important, and was so overpowering, if you wish, that it kind of extinguished any desire to cover, let's say, an affair. The fact that he was here in Britain, he was bringing a cause to Parliament, that became the headline story. He was a headline grabber, but I think what grabbed the headlines was the right things, rather than.
and it was probably
affairs.
the right time.
Yeah.
And then obviously the Victoria now, but we're looking for an excuse to get rid of the East India Company.
Absolutely, yeah. The defeat of the East India Company in Parliament in 1856, because of his campaign, is the death knell of the East India Company, because within 10 months, India moves from company to crown.
We're going to have to wind it up. It's a really fascinating bit of history, and a brilliant book by a brilliant man.
Thank you
very much.
Henry.
Very nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Oh yeah, so we'll go up the back. If you'd like to come and have a look at the books, we'll be there.